So today we'll talk about Pester tests at scale. To get an idea for your experience, how many people are currently using Pester to test their code? So I'd say about 50%-ish. Cool. How many of you have heard of Pester before coming to this session? Okay, most people. That's good. That's great because there's no introductory content of Pester in this session, so good that we're all on the same page there. So a little bit about myself. My name is Jaap, so the J is pronounced as a Y, so it's a bit silly, just like me. I'm a developer advocate at Harness. They do cool stuff with CI/CD. I'm talking about Pester today, so there won't be anything about Harness, but they're a super cool company because they sent me here, so thank you. For anyone who wants some swag, I brought some squeaky canaries. Yeah, a little bit about myself. I like coding, although it comes and goes. My GitHub is a bit of a wasteland in recent months. I should do more there. Speaking, like today, and the occasional blogging. Other than that, a big thank you to Gracie in the audience. She likes to get attention. I was supposed to bring my Pester t-shirt from the Netherlands because at the last PowerShell event we all printed these, or rather Jaap, the guy that maintains Pester, printed these for us. But of course I'm very scatterbrained, so I didn't bring it. Thank you. So as for the premise, not the premises in this case, what are we going to talk about today? So we're obviously going to talk about testing, talk about writing tests, Pester tests at that, and talk about avoiding writing too many tests and the kind of tools we use with that. Spoiler about the tools, we're going to be quite minimalistic when it comes to additional tooling because we don't need that much from my point of view. And then we'll go over some of the challenges, how I solve those. A lot of the demos that I have here will all be published in the DevOps PS Summit repository. So if you want to get your hands dirty with some of the things that I'll either be showing live or be showing during the presentation, it will all be online. And if it isn't, let's see. Yeah, my Twitter handle is there. Just poke me, and I will put it up there. Sweet. As for interactivity, if you have a question during the session, just put up your hand, and I'll finish my sentence or my story, and I'll be happy to take questions during the session, and I'll leave some time at the end as well. Does that sound good? Excellent. Yeah, it's a Monday, so it's always it's a great day to be presenting because you're all still fresh, and I'm gonna ruin you for the rest of the conference. I just know it. Sweet. So as I mentioned, we're going to be quite minimalistic when it comes to the kind of tooling that we're using. So you've probably heard of Pester. So obviously we're going to be needing Pester. And just to get an idea, how many of you know which version of Pester they're currently using? And of those people, can you keep your hand up if you're using version 5? Everyone, nice. Did you find any challenges when you moved from Pester 4 to Pester 5, or were you already a good citizen? Okay, I see some nodding, some head shaking. It's a bit of a mixed bag. I definitely had some issues because at the time Pester 5 was released, I had just finished a big project of, we ended up with over, I think, either 1,700 or 2,700 unit tests for one of the modules that I worked on. and it was not according to the Pester 5 guidelines, so everything broke. We'll talk a bit about that in this session as well, what kind of things to look out for. There was also a good session about this last year, or it was either last year or one of the online versions of the PS Summit. Other than that, we do our coding in VS Code, so I presume that most of you are aware of VS Code. The packages that are the minimal requirement are Pester tests, so you can run them directly from VS Code, and of course the PowerShell package. That just greatly simplifies working with anything PowerShell related in VS Code. But since this is a PowerShell summit, I assume that a lot of you are already aware of that. Sweet. So, what kind of challenges do we have when we are starting to scale our Pester test? One of the things that I already mentioned is the kind of the versioning of the test. But before we get into some of that, we have to actually write the tests. And there's a couple of things that I don't like doing when it comes to coding and coding adjacent things. I mean, writing the code is fun. Getting it to work is fun. Then making the code proper is already less fun, because my fun factor kind of stops when it does what I need it to do. But all the way down for me is documentation and writing unit tests, functional tests, integration tests, that kind of thing. It's not the most interesting, thing in the world. And the things you have to keep in mind when you're creating your Pester test is that you make sure that the code that you write can actually be tested by Pester, because there are some constructs that you can be using in your code. For example, if in your code you're validating whether you're running Windows PowerShell or you're running regular PowerShell, modern PowerShell. If you just do it by testing the default variables that are available, then there's no way for you to test it inside of Pester. Well, I say no way, there's always a way, but no good way of testing it in Pester. So in order to work around those kind of issues, what you can do is you can create a helper function that just does something really simple, like it just tests whether the function will just return true or false if it's modern PowerShell, or true or false if it's Windows. Those kind of helper functions can make it easier to later on mock your code and make sure that your code is actually testable. And if you keep those kind of things in mind when you're starting a new project, you make it a lot easier for yourself and for others to create tests around that. The second part is what to test, because there's this thing called code coverage. You want to be able to cover as much code as possible, but it's not all sensible to test that. Then we have actually writing the tests, the fun part, I suppose. And then afterwards, validating the test, because you can write a test and it can show a green check mark, and that's good, or it can fail. But you have to be sure that the test actually is representative of what you want, because anyone can write a test, if true is true, with a nice title, and then, of course, it's always going to be true. So validate your tests after creating them, and of course, you don't have to go over every test, but initially, when you start creating your test, make sure that they actually do the job that you expect them to do. So the biggest recommendation I have there is the moment you are writing your code, make sure that at that time you also create the tests around it. Because for me, it's probably my age as well. The longer ago it is, the more the code fades away. And it used to be, if I come back to a piece of code that I wrote 6 months ago, I kind of still understood. Now if I wrote the code 6 hours ago, I have no idea what this idiot before me did. So it's good to do it while you are in the right context of actually creating the code. So it can be tempting when you're on a go. You're creating a lot of creating a lot of code to keep on cranking out one function after the other, another flow, another cool feature into it. But if you push it back too far, I'm definitely guilty of that. I'm a master procrastinator. So do it when you are actually creating it. So that's the part of the tests. Then the other part, if you're working together, and that is, if you're working together with others, that's part of the at scale thing. Whether it's a public GitHub repository or an internal repository where you work with your colleagues, having some kind of contribution guidelines. On GitHub, there's contributing.md. If it's an internal repository, you can have a documentation, you can have a wiki, but just make sure that it's communicated to both for yourself and for the people you work with or the potential contributors, that they know what is expected. So give some kind of context about what kind of unit test, what kind of integration test you are expecting when you're taking contributions. Then we get to versions. So there's a lot of versions to be considering when you're testing your code. There's of course your operating system. If you're going to run registry tests against a Linux system, then it's of course never going to be successful. So keeping in mind the operating system you're on when you're both developing your code as well as developing your unit tests is an important thing. The PowerShell version, it matters a lot. There's a lot of gotchas when you're using older versions of PowerShell, especially when you're working with web commandlets. But the more I work in the cloud, the more I work with invoke web request and invoke REST method. If you're still using the Windows PowerShell, there's a lot of limitations there, especially in regards to how it handles JSON, and there's some bugs in there and some gotchas when you come to Unicode. So being aware of what PowerShell version you're using and testing your code appropriately is something to keep in mind. The different .NET versions, this was more of an issue on earlier versions of PowerShell. Thinking back of PowerShell version 2, PowerShell version 3, then the kind of .NET service pack you had installed determined how certain commandlets worked. So if you are still in a situation where you have to support PowerShell 2, PowerShell 3, just to do a show of hands, or the embarrassing show of hands, who still writes for PowerShell 2 compatibility? Well, two people for PowerShell 2. That's yeah. I feel for you, but keep in mind if you're using. Are you using Pester on PowerShell 2 as well?
We're not using Pester on PowerShell 2, but
okay.
We support PowerShell 2, so all of the actual PowerShell that's not test has to be PowerShell 2.
I see. That's. I've been in the situation for years, so I feel for you. But nowadays I'm a bit spoiled with all the new functionality in PowerShell. So yeah. What else? And then the versions of additional tooling. So if you're calling external commands, for example, if you're working with Azure and using some of the Azure CLI stuff from PowerShell, because some of the PowerShell modules might not be up to spec. Then it's important to keep that in mind and also design your tests around that. Any questions so far? Sweet. So I already alluded to it. Some of the testing that can be important to do is test for Unicode. I work in a lot of I work in international environments. I come from a language where we don't use any funky characters, but there are a lot of languages in Europe and outside of Europe that use a lot of special characters, and I've run into it multiple times with PowerShell. Oh, by the way, is it big enough in the back? Yeah, good. So later when I'm showing actual code, then I'll be able to zoom in. These I can't really zoom in anymore. I don't have a zooming tool. Sorry. But the testing we do here is we use one of these helper functions that I mentioned before. So we do test Unicode in string, and we validate whether there's Unicode in there. Fun fact about actually the regex that I use in this test Unicode in string, it was actually alumni speaker Matthias. Some of you might know him as IAS Reset Me. He helped me out with the regex because I'm terrible with regex, and ChatGPT didn't exist back then, so Matthias was my ChatGPT. But the validation we do here is just to make sure if there's Unicode in there. And the reason I wrote these specific tests was because in Windows PowerShell there are Unicode limitations for the web commandlets. So we can see that the function here, it's a little bit small. It's just a single regex in here that just validates if any characters in the output are outside of the regular ASCII range. And the reason we do that is because the invoke web requests. I always max. Yeah, thank you. I got a nod. Invoke web requests, when it returns the content, it will actually mess up all the special characters. So you have to forcefully pull that out there. This cost me a day and a half to figure out how this worked. So not entirely fun. And this is completely unnecessary when you're using PowerShell 6 or later. So sweet. The other thing. Having good documentation in your PowerShell modules is very valuable. But I ran into situations. Of course, I automatically generate my documentation. There's a lot of helper modules for that. It will just generate .md files or .html files, whatever you need, based on your comment-based help in your PowerShell module, in your PowerShell functions. But what I ran into was that I found out that unlike Windows, web servers are actually very sensitive to capitalization. So I broke all my documentation by automatically generating the file names for let's see what was called for the documentation. So I caught that by just making sure that if there is documentation, that there was no uppercase, lowercase available. The second one is doing the actual validation that the link is exactly as I expect it to be, rather than just assuming that it went right. Because I automatically generate a lot of functions, and when I don't automatically generate functions, my easiest way to start with a new function is just to copy paste and then adapt some changes in the function, but sometimes I leave the old names in there and then things break. So this one saved me more than once. The other part is putting up some kind of scaffolding. This can be done in multiple ways. There are modules out there for you that can help out with scaffolding your testing. Another thing that you can do is you can put a number. It of course depends on what kind of testing you're doing. If you're just creating a module, you will probably have some unit tests. But if you're using Pester for infrastructure testing, anyone here doing infrastructure testing? Sweet. Yeah, I've done quite a bit with that as well. Setting up scaffolding, setting up example tests that you can either simply copy paste, or if you go one step further, automatically generate tests based on your functions and based on your module can be a quite powerful way. I have a couple of scripts for that one that are included in the repository as well. Another one, when you're running a lot of tests, so once you start getting into the thousands and thousands of tests, or if you have a module with a lot of functions, so hundreds of functions or thousands of functions, it can take extremely long time for all the tests to execute. So there's a couple of things that you can do. You can try to be smart about which kind of tests you execute. So only run the tests of the code that actually changed, or you can try to speed up the process. So one of the things that I found helped a lot with speeding up how the tests run. It's quite valuable for me to be able to split up my module in like multiple functions, and also for each function to be in its own file, and then the tests for those functions also to be in their own file. But the downside of that is, in every one of those tests, you'll have to import the module, as you can see there. And if you have a big module, that can take about a couple of milliseconds, maybe a couple hundred, depending on how big your module is. And if you're running a couple thousand tests over, let's say, a couple hundred different functions, it starts to become really slow. So there's a couple of things you can do. Already mentioned, you can try to be smarter about which tests you run. Depending on what kind of pipeline you have, what kind of tooling you use, there are technologies for CI pipelines where it just automatically where it just takes a look at your code and only runs the tests that are available. You can try to be smart about it yourself, but that's a little bit harder, and I'm not that smart. The other part of what you can do is you can still write your test in this format, but then as part of the build process, once you commit it to your repository or wherever you want it to be, just merge all your tests into a single file, so you only have to import that module once. The other way of doing it can also be to split up the test and execute it on multiple machines. So if you're using like Azure DevOps, or in my case, I use the Harness platform quite often, or if you want something more lightweight, GitHub Actions is also a good one for running some simple tests. You can split up your tests and run it on multiple instances. So one of the things that I like to use this for is for every operating system. Just start a new runner to start running the tests. And if you have a lot of tests, start a runner for the first 10 tests on that operating system, and you can split it up however you want, but it can become harder to maintain if you go too far with splitting it up. So I haven't had the need to go beyond splitting it up by operating system, and then on the operating system split it up by PowerShell version. So if you want to be testing for PowerShell version, every PowerShell version that exists, you can end up with a lot of runners. How are we doing on time? Good. And the best advice is, of course, to not write tests at all. Thank you. So, looking to the future, scaffolding is, of course, a good way to go about it. Automatically generating tests can be quite valuable if you set it up properly. But the challenge with that one is it really depends what kind of module you're writing, or what kind of tests you want to, what kind of scripts or functions you are working with. If it's something that's often repeated, for example, you write you write an API wrapper, so you just have a bunch of web commandlets. It's pretty easy to automatically generate tests for that, as long as your functions are rather simplistic. But if you have a collection of tools to manage Active Directory, automatically generating some tests is easy, but to go really in depth, it becomes quite hard. So the next step is, of course, seeing what we can do with OpenAI ChatGPT. So I gave it a small function. So very simple, add number, and just had it generate some unit tests. And into ChatGPT version, I get some unit tests. So does anyone want to tell me if this is good, or is this bad? Is this Pester 4? Is it Pester 5? Yep, that's right. Why is it not going to work with Pester 5?
Because you're importing your function outside of your context block.
Yep, that is correct. So for people listening in, the reason this won't work, this used to work in Pester 4. You could just import it like this, but it's outside of the describe block. You want to have it inside of the describe block, and you would probably put it in a before all block if you put it in there. So that won't work. The other part, is there anything else wrong? Or suboptimal? So one of the things that we don't want to do in Pester is doing parameter validation. And in this case, what it tries to do is it tries to get the module to throw. But if you would run this code, it would actually interrupt your Pester test, and it would ask for input rather than throwing. So you would just get stuck the moment you run this test. Also, Matthias says no. This is the Stack Overflow post with the link to the Pester team blog post. Oh, yeah. Thank you. So no, we should not be doing that, and that's also some of the challenges we have when we are working with language models like this, because those language models, you can use them to automatically generate tests, and I just showed the two worst examples. The next up is going to be an example where it does actually work and where it can be quite helpful. It is trained on all the code that we collectively ever created. Have you looked at your own code from 10 years ago? Yeah, I know, it's the best code ever. It sometimes worked. I have no idea why. But yeah, it's also trained on that, and because of that, the results can be a bit wonky. But there are some things that we can do with it, and for that, we'll do a live demo. Are we still here? Sweet. Cool. So is this big enough in the back? I can make it bigger too. Yeah, no problem. Let's see. Cool. So I have my number adding function. So the function itself is not that interesting, but it makes it a bit more manageable, especially with a little bit of screen real estate that we have here. So we do add number. We can see it does what we expect it to do. It comes back with 5 if we do 3 and 4. Of course, we have the tests. So these are the correct tests for it. We have a couple of tests where it will just do some addition and see if it comes out. Not too interesting. At the end, we validate if the output type is what we expect it to be. If we go into add number, you can see that I have already sabotaged it because I tested it. But I'll put it to long. So The difference between long and an integer is whether you're using a 32-bit or a 64-bit, so the number is either smaller or longer. So right now, I'll do, of course, I'll run it from here. So we click Run Tests. And we can see that the test successfully run and everything is good. And then we'll break it. Nothing too exciting here. We do invoke Pester. Oh, I didn't save it? Oh, thank you. I was testing you. Thank you. We do invoke Pester. We can see, all right, well, something isn't working. So normally our next step would be to, okay, let's take a look at the code itself, open up our test, see which one failed, see what's going on there, then head over to the code and take a look at what we should fix. Whether the test is broken or the code is broken, or both, or neither, but neither is usually not the case. But we can do this way cooler, of course, and the autocomplete was already alluding to that. So we have invoke Pester GPT. And this one worked before. Let's see if it works now. So what it does, it is just a wrapper around invoke. Let's go up. So it's just a wrapper around Pester itself. So we just take the Pester object using the pass-through parameter. The test is failed. It takes the failed test. It gets the information out of it. So we get the code block of the test itself. And I send the function itself to GPT as well. And then I prompted it to come up with a solution, actually come up with two solutions. I tell it, okay, this is my test, this is my code. Tell me how I can fix my unit test and explain it to me, and tell me how I can fix my code and explain it to me. And that is what we get here. So you can see it comes up with something that is actually correct. So wait a minute, so this one, the unit test is, so, no, this one is not correct. It has been correct occasionally. It's not always correct. And this one is actually correct, and it changed it to int 64. Int 64 and long are the same. Long is just an accelerator. I think it's called an accelerator, or maybe it's an alias for int 64. So that one is correct. The first one was not.
It is technically correct because it's going to make the test pass. Yeah. I mean, you're changing the test.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that is a good point. And yeah, the code for this itself. The idea behind this one is either use it in the console. I have been working to also integrate it into my GitHub pipelines. That one is not finished yet, but whenever a pull request comes in for my PowerShell projects, what I want is whenever a test fails, that the bot will just come in and just will comment into the pull request, this test failed, and this is what you can do to fix it. And then, of course, use your own brain, because, yeah. So that is something that simplified my workflow a little bit. And yeah, the code itself is pretty simple. Just do an API call. Here's the prompt that I gave it. And then just get it back and write it out to the console. So nothing too exciting there. And with that, so the idea here was there is a lot of value in testing, but I don't find a lot of value into wasting my time writing tests. So I've been trying to find ways to make it easier for myself to generate tests. So create a single test that will run against all commandlets, for example, with the documentation, but there's more opportunity depending on what kind of module or functions you're writing. And the up-and-coming part of it is experiment with GPT and see what it can do for your workflow as well, because I found this quite helpful that it can come up with solutions. Caveat there is that there are some limitations with how much we can put in there per prompt. There are a lot of workarounds, but it's definitely out of scope of this out of this talk. And with that, I would like to open it up for questions. Yes. That one was GPT-3, and I can 3.5, but it's also in here because the model I'm using is DaVinci 003. But you can do it with GPT-4 as well. Oh yeah, and the question I'll also repeat. The question was, which model of GPT was I using for this demo? So the question is, have I experimented with Copilot at all? Because Copilot also offers the capability to generate tests. Yes, I've also used Copilot for that. I haven't extensively worked with it or tried to apply it to some of my production modules, but it seemed to come up with decent code, but it has similar challenges that it can generate code, but it's not always the best code. So it does need some hand-holding. But in both cases, I think the main advantage is that even if the code isn't 100%, if you are yourself capable of writing that code, it can take a lot of work away from you, because even if half of the code is completely bonkers and doesn't do anything, if there's half of the code there that does do something good for you, it can be quite valuable. And additionally, what I like about it is that it gives you a starting point as well. So it can be, thank you. You can break down like a mental block if you have to get started on something. It takes the first hump out of the way already. So the question is, have I used Pester to do linting, do enforcing styles? I've played with it. I've never implemented it because I never have a very strict style. Functional is good enough for me. But the things that you can do with it, you can, what's it called again? The analyzer. Yeah, PScript analyzer. You can use those rules and you can validate your scripts, and yeah, that's very easy to well, very easy. I mean, it's a relatively light load to implement it. Yes, in the back.
Not a question, but
Okay, so we got feedback that someone in the audience already did a lot of work with it. Could you share it with us? Unfortunately, it can't be shared with me, but it can be shared with you. All right, anyone else? Cool, in that case, I'll give you 4 minutes back.